We're going to play an association game. I'm just going to say something, and you don't have to blurt it out or anything. I just want you to think of the first picture that comes to your mind. If I say 1990s, what do you think about? Maybe, I don't know, Ken probably thinks about the dominance of the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. So he loved the decade. If you're a Bengals fan, you remember that decade very differently, right? Maybe you think of grunge rock. Maybe you think of, anybody remember the Koosh Ball? Yeah, the Koosh Ball. Maybe you think of Saved by the Bell. To me, Saved by the Bell is like the quintessential 90s show. But you think of the 90s, like a lot of different things can come to your mind. What if I say to you, Canada? What comes to your mind? Hockey, maple syrup. Somebody says A lot, you know? What if I say CrossFit? Gyms, cult. CrossFit and veganism kind of go together. You know how somebody does CrossFit and veganism? Because they tell you. Like nobody does CrossFit and nobody's a vegan that hasn't told you about it. What if I just say a name to you? Karen. See, something comes up. She wants to speak with a manager, right? What if I say Star Wars? Now, this is generational, right? So if you're younger in my generation, like I was a kid when they started releasing the new ones. So do you think of the new ones, or do you think of the 1970s, 1980s Star Wars? Something comes up. Some of you have never seen Star Wars, and you're like, I've made it this far in life, not giving up now. I'm holding strong, right? What about generations? Every generation has a stereotype. What if I say boomer, Gen X, millennial? Oh, we don't like them, do we? I'm a millennial. Gen Z. Like something comes to your mind. All of these words, they all elicit some certain image in your mind. Now, what if I say Christian? What comes to your mind if I say Christian? I think, depending on who you ask, I think if we were to walk out of these doors, even in this room, if we were to ask 10 people, we'd probably get 10 different answers. If we walk out of these doors and ask people outside of the church, what is a Christian? I promise you we're going to get 10 different answers. For some, they would be like, I don't know, maybe hypocrites. Some would be, you don't struggle with the challenges and the mistakes in life. You're immune to that kind of stuff, or at least you're really good pretending like you do. Or maybe they'll think that Christians hold themselves to some type of moral superiority. I think most people in this room just vaguely would say, as a Christian, like, I'm trying to follow Jesus and figure that out. Like, there's some vagueness to it that I don't quite fully understand all the time, but you know what? That's why I'm here. Even culture as a whole will give a broad assumption or try to define what a Christian is and get you to try to determine whether or not you are a Christian based on how they define it. So you can be like, well, I was born in America. I believe in God, I guess. Like, God makes sense to me. I'm not opposed to there being a God. My grandma, she took me to church sometimes. I've been to a Christian church. So yeah, I guess I'm a Christian. But what does it actually mean to be a Christian? The truth is, to be a Christian means to follow Jesus and living in a life of discipleship. Simple. Follow Jesus and live a life of discipleship. But to live a life of discipleship means that you are willing to obey him even when it's difficult. The first Christians, they weren't called Christians. They didn't call themselves Christians. The first time that we see Christian used in the Bible, it's actually used as a derogatory term towards Christians because people were mocking them because they were trying to be like Jesus Christ. They were like, look at those people trying to be like Christ. They're Christians. Like, it wasn't a term of endearment. It was meant as an insult. Do you know in Scripture, we see Christian 3 times. We see disciple 281 times. So the word disciple is far more descriptive, far more compelling of what it actually means to follow Jesus. And what we're going to see today is the concept that a disciple, or the definition of a disciple, what it means to be a disciple, it exposes the fact that a lot of people who claim to be Christians aren't actually following Jesus. So historically, this is how it would happen. This was the context of what it meant to be a Christian, or the concept, not to be a Christian, but we'll say the context of what it meant to be a disciple in this time and period. So all Hebrew boys would start going to what we'll call primary school to learn the Torah when they were 5 years old. So this first 5 books of the Bible. All right. So they would go to school 5 years. They would be educated in the first 5 books of the Bible, and they would do that until they were 10. At 10 years old, the very best students were selected to continue their education, which they would stay until they were 17. So if you were a good student, you got to stay in school, continue your theological education, and you would study the rest of the Old Testament. If you weren't selected, you weren't one of the best students, you weren't one of the selected students, you didn't perform well in school for whatever reason, then you were just finished with school at 10 years old and you went back to work with your family. So you learned the family business. If your family was fishermen, you learned how to be a fisherman. If it was blacksmith, what carpentry, whatever it was, if you weren't selected, then you went back, learned the family business, and you just went to work. For those that were selected, again, they would study the rest of the Old Testament up until they were about 17. And then at 17 years old, they had to decide at that point what they were going to do. So in this time, the NFL draft just happened, right? It just happened a few weeks ago. For everyone that was selected in the draft, it was probably their dream to make it to the NFL. This is what they wanted to do. They put in the time, the effort, the hard work. They hear their name called. Their dreams are coming true. In first century Judaism, nobody dreamed about getting drafted in the NFL. Nobody wanted to be a professional athlete. There's none of that. What boys in this context wanted to do is they wanted to become a religious scholar. They wanted to become a religious leader because this was a position with status. This was a position with respect, with honor that you were looked at with everybody around you. So if you were selected to continue your education after 10, you would stay until you were 17. And then at 17, you had to find a rabbi that you wanted to learn from. And if you found a rabbi that you wanted to learn from, you wanted to become his disciple, or the word in the Greek, I believe, is talmidim. So you would become the talmidim of a respected rabbi at that point. You would go to him, and then you would sit at his feet. Sitting at his feet was your way of expressing to him that you wish to be his disciple. And so he would then examine you, ask you questions, kind of like their version of an entrance exam, kind of follow you around, watch your life. You'd follow him around. And all this time would just be talking and observing. And then he would make a decision on whether or not he was going to allow you to be his talmidim, his disciple, his student. Now, the rabbis, they could be incredibly selective. They had the right to be incredibly selective. They could pick the best of the best of the best. They didn't have to just take a student just because. They got to pick the brightest. And they didn't want to just take someone who they thought could learn from them. They wanted to pick someone who would actually become like them. Not just know what they know, but who would actually imitate them and do what they did. That's what it means to be a disciple. Not just a student to learn, but to actually imitate the one that you are learning from. And so then for several years, the disciples would follow that rabbi around, imitating them in every way, with the goal themselves of eventually becoming a rabbi just like that rabbi. It was a compliment that you could get back in the day was if somebody said to you that you have the dust of your rabbi all over you, that wasn't an insult. That was saying you are following them so closely. You are imitating them so well. You are just like that person, that their dust is all over you. And this is how rabbis would get selected, or this is how disciples would get selected to be the students of a rabbi. But then Jesus comes in and he flips the script. He reverses the entire system and turns it all upside down in Matthew chapter 4 when we see him select his first disciples. We actually saw this a few months ago when we started in the book of Mark, but now we're going to look at it from Matthew. And here's what it says in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 22. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Here's the first thing that we see when it comes to Jesus choosing his disciples. Jesus doesn't choose the best. He chooses the willing. Jesus doesn't choose the best, he chooses the willing. So when Jesus finds these guys, what are they doing? They're on their boat, mending their nets, fishing, right? The fact that they were fishing, what does that tell you about them? They weren't selected. They weren't part of that group that was selected to continue their education. They're fishing with their dad. They're learning the family business at this point. They're not in school. They weren't part of the A team that was selected to continue their theological education. Let that sink in for a minute. When you were a kid and you were on recess and you were picking teams for kickball or whatever it was, or especially for dodgeball, you wanted the kid with a hose. You wanted a kid with a cannon, right? You wanted him to take out everybody else so you didn't get hit in the face. And this was back when they used the real dodgeballs, the one that left like the marks on your face when you got hit by them. And then they left your face red and then to swell up a little bit for the rest of the day. The real dodgeballs, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, the good ones. They were harder to grip, but they hurt when they got you, right? So when you wanted to pick the fastest, biggest, strongest, most athletic kid on your team. You wanted the A team. You wanted to be on the good team. Jesus doesn't pick from the A team. Jesus picks from the B team intentionally. He didn't pick the kids who were selected to continue their theological education. He picked the kids who told they weren't good enough. Or at this point, the teenagers, the guys who were told they weren't good enough. You're done. Your education's over. Go back and be fishermen. Jesus chose this squad to be how he started his movement. He chose the B team. He started in that reverse order. He chose guys without a ton of potential or personal power. I like what John MacArthur says about this. John MacArthur, he says this: God skipped all the wise of the day. The great scholars were in Egypt. The great library was in Alexandria. The great philosophers were in Athens. The powerful were in Rome. He passed over Herodotus, the historian, Socrates, the great thinker, and Julius Caesar. He chose men so ordinary it was comical. No rabbis, no teachers, no religious experts. Jesus chose the B team intentionally because Jesus' work in the world, it wouldn't come from the abilities of the guys that were going for him or that he was sending, that he was developing, but all of his work in the world that would be accomplished wouldn't be because of their talents, but it would be because of what he does through them. Not because of their gifts, their talents, their abilities, but because of what Jesus does in his power through these people. People with a lot of talent and ability, they would have just gotten in the way. Because if they're strong and gifted and talented on their own, they never would have been able to fully rely on Jesus' power. And what Jesus is doing here is he is saying that his power in the weakest person is infinitely greater than the greatest talent without him. By choosing those who were weak, who were not selected, who were learning to be fishermen at this point, he's saying, this is who I'm going to use to change the world. And by selecting these, you know that it's going to be my power in them and through them. Because no one was gifted enough to do what Jesus was about to call these guys to do. And anyone with talent or skill, they would have been tempted to take the credit on their own. So they were excluded. Jesus purposefully chose the weak. He chose those who would have thought on their own they were inadequate. That speaks, or that should speak to everybody in this room. That God wants to use you in your family, in your workplace, at school, with your friends, your sphere of influence, whatever it is, he wants to use you. Stop making excuses that you are not able. Jesus doesn't need your ability. Jesus only requires your availability. He doesn't call the equipped. He doesn't call the talented and be like, you know what? That's the person I need on my team right there. This is somebody who's going to accomplish a lot for me. I can just send them out and then I can sit it out. That's not who Jesus calls. Jesus doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. If Jesus has called you, you are adequate to be a disciple of his and to share. Have you made yourself available to him? Or are you still struggling with that inadequacy? Because that's who Jesus chose. But look who initiates this. In the Hebrew, in that culture, it would have been the students. They would have been the one who initiated the movement, right? They would have found the rabbi. They would have gone to him. They would have sat at his feet. It was all on them. Look who initiates the movement here. It was Jesus. Jesus goes to these guys as a rabbi. He goes to them and he chooses them. And in verse 19, he says to them, follow me. So Jesus said in verse 19, follow me. These guys were not out looking for a rabbi. The normal way all of this went down was you would go to that rabbi, sit at his feet, wait, hope you got selected, but that's not what happened here. And think about if you were having a bad day. Like if you were having a bad day, but your rabbi selected you, you could take confidence in that, right? If your rabbi liked you and he selected you, you could take confidence in the fact that I've accomplished something enough that my rabbi selected me, my rabbi liked me, my rabbi approved of me. Think about when you were coming out of high school, if you had applied to, we'll just say Ivy League colleges. You're coming out of high school, you apply to Harvard, Yale, MIT, whatever it is, you apply to all of these and you get into them, and then you're at Harvard, you're on campus one day, you're having a bad day, you're really struggling, and you can at least take some confidence in the fact that Harvard selected you. You're like, I'm still a student at Harvard. I'm still a student at Yale. I'm still a student. Like, I accomplished something. Just being a student there, that's an accomplishment in itself. And so if these young Jewish men, if they were struggling, if they were having a bad day, they could say, but my rabbi chose me. My rabbi believed in me. I've accomplished enough that I was selected. But again, Jesus changed the entire process. He chose us, not we him. Jesus chose us, not we him. These disciples, they didn't come and sit at Jesus' feet. They weren't looking for a rabbi. They weren't looking to be a disciple of anybody, but Jesus went out seeking them when they weren't looking and said, follow me. Some of you, we all have struggles. Some of you in this room, you're struggling right now. Marriage, relationships, career, parenting, struggling with big decisions. But you can believe this, and this is where you can find your confidence if you are a disciple of Jesus. You do not have to find your confidence in something that you have accomplished. You and I, we have accomplished nothing of eternal significance on our own. We haven't. But if you are a disciple of Jesus, you can find all your confidence in knowing that Jesus chose you. If you are a disciple of Jesus, then he chose you. And there's nothing better in the world than to know that the God of the universe left heaven, died on the cross for you, chose you, and selected you to be a part of his family. In John 15:16, Jesus says this, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. So he says, I chose you, or you did not choose me, but I chose you. Now, when Jesus says this, I do not think it is Jesus' intent to begin a conversation on election and predestination and free will. I don't think Jesus is trying to start an argument here on Calvinism versus Arminianism. That's not what he's saying. But when Jesus says, you did not choose me, he's not nullifying the disciples' willingness to get up and follow him. They were still willing. He chose them. They responded in willingness and obedience to follow. Jesus here, he's emphasizing the ultimate factor that in determining who gets to follow him, it's Jesus' choice. And he says that they should bear fruit. This implies that the purpose of a disciple of Jesus, someone following him, the purpose is not merely that they would be saved, forgiven, and given eternal life. But the implication is that they would become a reproducing disciple, living and fulfilling God's purposes on their lives. So he chose us, not we him. And look at the first, again, in that verse 19 in chapter 4. The first part of that call, it says, follow me. So this call has two parts. And that first part is follow me. Our primary calling is to be with him. It's not to do something for him. And I think this is what gets, I think this is where we really struggle with the concept of discipleship. Like, what does it mean to be a disciple for Jesus, right? What does it mean to be a Christian? Well, it means I check this box, I check this box, I go to church this many hours, I read this many chapters a day, I pray before I eat. Like, I do all of these things. Like, we want to narrow it down to where this boxes that we get to check on this list. Why? Because we love lists. If we can check off boxes, we know we're making progress. Jesus doesn't give us a list of boxes to check. He says, follow me. He didn't tell them where they were going. They didn't know their assignment. They had no idea what he had for them. But his primary call for them was not to do something, but it was to become like him, to be with him, and to become like Jesus. You need to know Jesus, right? You can't become like somebody that you don't know. You can't imitate somebody that you're not spending time with. And to know Jesus, you need to know his word. And we have many outlets for that here. Well, of course, we have Sunday morning service where we're gathered right now. We have our grace groups where we go deeper into kind of what we talk about this morning for discipleship, discussion, application. We open it up. So rather than sitting in rows, we sit in circles, go deeper there. We have Aspire, which is a smaller group of discipleship that happens in the context of 3 to 5 people. We're starting Summer Seminary to take you deeper in your knowledge of the Bible. And even outside of that, there's podcasts and resources, more resources available now forever today that if you wanted to take advantage of them, you could. We talked about this last week in our group. I think we would all make progress in our relationship with Jesus if we were all just very brutally honest with ourselves. We are all as close to Jesus as we want to be. Like right now, you are as close to Jesus as you want to be. If you want to be closer to him, you can do something about it. You might say you want to be closer to him, but if you actually desire to be closer to Jesus, you have the ability to do something about it. That's what we try to do here at Grace. We want to give you the opportunity, and we want to give you the on-ramps and everything we can to help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. There's a pastor I listen to in Nashville. His name's Robbie Gallaty. He says the same thing over and over. He says, get in the Word until the Word gets in you. That you just become so familiar with the Bible that it dominates your thinking and your behavior until you can just talk it and quote it and speak it at will. That it just modifies, or that it directs all of your behavior. And when Jesus called these disciples and he said, follow me, they responded in verse 22, immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So we see they left 2 things. Matthew here, he identifies 2 things that they left, their boat and their father. Why do you think these are the 2 things that were significant enough for him to say that they left? What do these things represent? They were fishermen. What did their boat represent? This was their career. This was how they took care of themselves. This was how you provide for your family. This is how you build a living. He says he left their father. These are our most intimate, personal, and significant relationships. So when Jesus says, follow me, and they left their boat and they left their father, Matthew is saying they left everything they knew that they took confidence in, the one way they knew to make a living, and they walked away from the people that were the most significant relationships in their lives. And to follow Jesus, he has to take precedence over both. This is what we talked about when we started Mark at the beginning of the year. We started for months asking the same question. What's your one? What's that one thing in your life that you pursue and desire above all else? It can be that career, status, relationships, marriage, kids, whatever it is, money. Whatever that one is, Jesus must take precedence over it. Now, most of you, you're not literally going to lose your mother and father by choosing to follow Jesus. Some of you might. Some of you, your faith might cost you relationships. Most of you aren't actually going to lose your job. You're not going to lose your career by choosing to follow Jesus. But for some of you, you might. God might call you to change careers. That's what he did for me. This was not my career path. This was not what I started doing. I had an undergrad in business, and I was working for the Department of Corrections for 5 years. And then God redirected. And I don't say that because look how great I surrendered. That's not what happening. Like, it was a struggle, and I just felt like I had no choice at that point. He might call you to change if he doesn't call you to change careers, he might call you to transfer somewhere. Maybe we end up partnering with another church plant someday, 5-10 years from now, and God calls you to transfer so you can be a part of a church plant in another state somewhere. Or maybe God's going to call you to be an overseas missionary somewhere. For most of you, though, like, your life choosing to follow Jesus probably won't be that dramatic. It'll probably look very much like what you're doing right now. Faithfully being a part of the life of a local church, growing as a disciple, leading your family, making disciples, but you will have moments in your life when you are tested, and you must decide what holds greater sway over your life. You must decide, are you going to choose Jesus or something else? And the second part of that call, after he says, follow me, it's a call to action for the benefit of others in verse 19. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. If you grew up in church, you probably had this on like VBS t-shirt or something. I remember when I was a kid, we did like this like fisher, like deep sea fishing VBS themed. I don't know why I remember this. This just now popped in my head. I was like 7 years old, and there was a song we would sing, and it was called I'm HOOKED on Jesus. I'm hooked on Jesus. And now I'm like this. I'm actually embarrassed. I just said that. So, but what does it mean to be a fisher of men? Here's what I love about this verse. This verse has two parts. It has a command and it has a promise. The command is follow me. The promise is I will make you fishers of men. I think sometimes we can read this wrong. We can read this and say Jesus wants us to be fishers of men. So what Jesus is telling us is Jesus is commanding us to go fish. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying follow me. That's the command. You follow me, and the promise is then I will make you fishers of men. Jesus is the one who makes us fishers of men. He's the one who gives us a heart for evangelism. He's the one who gives us a heart for the people in our lives that don't know Jesus. But the command is first, follow Jesus. Following Jesus means subjecting everything in your life to his lordship. Because just like he was a fisher of men, if we are disciples, if we are people who imitate our Lord, people who imitate the rabbi that we are following, then we are going to do what he did, not just know what he knows. It's not just a transfer of information, but it is a transformation of your life. If he's a fisher of men, then we will be too. This is an essential part of being a disciple. This isn't something that only a few people do, but it's something that each of us does. There's no concept and there is no such thing as a non-reproducing Christian. Look through Scripture all you want. There is no concept of a Christian who is not reproducing. So how do you know if you are a disciple? Like that's a lot of pressure, right? If I'm not reproducing, how do I know if I'm a Christian? How do I know if I'm a disciple? By bearing fruit. And if you aren't bearing fruit, then you have reason to question whether you disciple at all. But this is where I think it is very, very important to unpack what it means to bear fruit. So when we talk to the gospel about, or we talk about the gospel, when we share the gospel, when we give the gospel to someone, can we always see what is going on under the surface of that person and see if that message is getting to their heart at all? Can we have that? Like, do we have that insight? No. Are there going to be times where we share the gospel with somebody and we get absolutely no feedback or nothing in return? Yes, it happens all the time. Just like fishing, it's very unpredictable. There's no guarantee you're going to catch anything. There's no guarantee of a reward. It requires patience and it requires risk. It takes faith. In faith, the fishermen that Jesus just called, they would go out into the lake, they'd go out into the sea, they'd cast their nets out there, they'd let the net fall to the bottom of the lake to where it went out of sight, and then over time, they'd pull it up and hope with their efforts that there would be a catch. If there was no catch, guess what? They still fished. Your fruitfulness or your success in following Jesus as a disciple of Jesus is not measured by how many converts you have. It's not measured by how many people you lead to Jesus. It's not measured by how many people you have a conversation with, they join the church, they get baptized, and then they become a missionary. That's not what your success is measured by. Your success, or your fruitfulness, rather, your fruitfulness as a disciple of Jesus is measured by your obedience to follow him, to be like him, and cast your net. That is it. For the past few weeks, we went over the parable of the soils again and again and again. We feel like we've referenced it for like over a month now. We see the conditions of the heart. We are not responsible for the conditions of the heart that we give the gospel to. We're only responsible for sharing it. And I think one of the things that keeps us from sharing it with people so often is this feeling of inadequacy. But again, look who Jesus chose. Jesus chose those who all of society would have labeled as inadequate, and they themselves would have felt that they were inadequate. We're not worthy of following Jesus, yet he said, follow me, and they came. When he says, follow me, you will be fishers of men, Jesus tells his disciples, he tells them how they're going to bear fruit. He says, but my Father is glorified that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. So we see over and over again, this idea of fruitfulness is how Jesus knows, or how we know that we are a disciple of Jesus. And he tells us how that happens in the Great Commission. It says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Like that's a promise right there too, that he is going to be with us. Everything that we do grows out of a call to make disciples. This is how Jesus summarized his entire ministry. In Luke 19, he says, I have come to seek and save the lost. And if we're disciples of Jesus, that should be true of our lives too. In his book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, Robert Coleman, he wrote this. He said, when will the church learn this lesson? Preaching to the masses, so what we're doing right now, although necessary, will never suffice in the work of preparing leaders for evangelism. Nor can occasional prayer meetings and training classes for Christian workers do the job. Individual women and men are God's method. God's plan for discipleship is not something, but someone. God's plan for discipleship is you. It's not just the pastor, it's not just leaders, it's not just teachers. It is you. God's plan for evangelism and discipleship is every person who knows Jesus. You are God's method. Brady, come over here and help me with this real quick. So what we're going to do is we want everybody to have the opportunity to be equipped and to be bold. Thanks, man. To be equipped, to be bold, and have the opportunity to take that first step into your life and being what Jesus calls a fisher of men. Now, this doesn't have to be super intimidating. Here's what we are going to do today. I'm going to ask you to participate. I'm actually going to ask you to respond. I see faces and you're like, this is the first time you've ever done this, Austin. I don't like it. Too bad. All right. So we're going to ask you to commit to something. I'm going to ask you to think of one person in your life that you want to know Jesus. I've shared this multiple times. I've got two people in my life right now that I pray about and like think about over and over. When they talk, I listen. I just look for those little things where I can hear what they're saying, and I look for an opportunity to share the gospel with them. Both of them, I've had the opportunity to share the gospel with them several times. Again, I can't see what's going on in their heart. I have no idea if what I say to them makes any impact at all. I don't know. But it doesn't mean I'm going to stop. Just like when the disciples, when they went out fishing, if they didn't catch anything, they still went fishing the next day. They're still going to take advantage of the conditions. They're going to take advantage of the good weather, the good days. They're going to go out when they think they're going to get something, and they're going to cast their nets. And so here's what I want you to do. I want everybody in here, if you're a disciple of Jesus, if you don't know Jesus, if you're not a Christian, you are exempt from this. Don't feel like you have to participate, okay? I don't want you to, you're not being pressured into this at all. But for those of you in here who do know Jesus, I want you to think of one person in your life that you want to have a relationship, you want to see have a relationship with Jesus. One person, that's it. If you want to have more than one, you can go 2, 3, but I'm going to cut you off at 5. If we have too many that say like, I'm going to be intentional about 175 people in my life, you're not going to tell anybody the gospel. But if you commit to pray for one person or for 2 people, and you say, I'm going to commit to praying for this person every day, I'm going to look for opportunities to share the gospel with them. And when they talk, I'm really going to listen so that I can bring that conversation back. So I can hear their story, I can relate their story to my story, and then ultimately I can point that to God's story and make a connection for them. 1 or 2 people. This morning, I already dropped one in, the white ping pong ball, to represent one of my ones. So when you think of that one person, as we're singing this last song, in response, what I want you to do is I want you to come up here, grab a ping pong ball, and drop it in there. And what we're going to do over time is we're going to see this start to fill up a little bit. Today, we're only dropping white ping pong balls. This is representative of the people in our lives that we want to see come to know Jesus. And then over time, it's going to start to change color, hopefully. If God lays somebody else on your life at a later date and you want to drop another ping pong ball in there for them, go for it. I'm not going to stop you. And then over time, we're going to see it start to change color a little bit. Blue. So I'm simple-minded. So I got blue because it starts with the same letter as boldness. All right. Blue. This is when you have had the opportunity and you had the boldness to actually share the gospel with them. You talked to them about Jesus. So first, the white, these are people we're praying for. And then after I share the gospel with somebody, I'm going to come by, whether on a Sunday, whenever it is, and I'm going to remember I had a conversation with them on Tuesday. I shared the gospel for the first time. Don't know if anything came of it, but I shared it with them. I'm going to drop a blue one in. And then we're all going to see this display of white ping pong balls, and then somebody's going to be the first to drop in a blue one. And we're like, look at this changing color. People are starting to share the gospel. And then, if by God's grace, you get to lead somebody to Jesus, green is the universal color of new life. If you get the opportunity to share the gospel with somebody, they respond and they give their life to Jesus, you're going to come by and drop a green one in this, and we are going to celebrate. And we're going to start to see this display fill up of different colors. So right now, I want you to just close your eyes just for a minute. Just think of one person in your life that you want to see come to know Jesus. And in just a minute, the band is going to play in our last song. And as we sing, I want you to take that first initial step of boldness of exiting your seat, coming up here, grabbing a ping pong ball to represent that person that God has given you in your life that you want to see come to know Jesus, and drop it in the display.